Very much indeed for coming this evening, and we're delighted that you're here. We're particularly delighted that our guest today is Baroness Shephard, Gillian Shephard. Gillian is an absolute icon of the Norfolk political scene. She was born in Cromer, went to school at North Walsham Girls' School, from which she then went to St Hilda's, Oxford, and studied modern languages. Her husband Tom, and Tom, we're very glad that you're here tonight, has an even closer relationship with the university because he did his PhD here in education some years ago. And so we're very glad you've come back to your alma mater, if that's the correct phrase, Tom. So thank you very much for coming this evening. Gillian had a long career in local government, but was then elected in 1987 to Parliament as a Member of Parliament for South West Norfolk. She was MP there from 1987 to 2005, and a very major presence from that local base then onto the national scene. She was a key member of John Major's government and served from 92 as Secretary of State for Employment, then from 93 as Secretary of State for Agriculture, and then 94 as Secretary of State for Education, including employment at that time. She was an essential figure for that very important period in British political history, and she spoke, I think it's not patronising to say, extremely clearly for the policies of that government at the time. I, of course, didn't agree with every aspect of what the government was doing, but there was no better advocate and explainer of what was happening in putting the arguments across very well. We are exceptionally grateful for you to come here this evening, Gillian. There's a book signing afterwards of her most recent book, but her first book, Shepherd's Watch, Illusions of Power in British Politics, was published in 2000. And she became then a peer, and she's a very active peer. I think you're still the president of the Association of Conservative Peers, Gillian, in the House of Lords at this extremely interesting time in British politics. It's an honour to us that you've agreed to come this evening. We appreciate it very much indeed. And so welcome, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And Charles, can I say thank you very much indeed for those extremely warm words. I do appreciate them, and I'm particularly delighted that you mentioned that Tom got his PhD here at the UEA. It's something he hugely enjoyed doing. He got to know the university and got also both of us to appreciate the role that the university has played since its inception in Norfolk and in Norwich. Now, can everybody hear at the back? I'm sure you can, because it's all impeccable, all of this, but, you know, it feels a bit lonely. You're all right up there, are you? Okay. Well, I also want to congratulate Charles for organising this extremely interesting series of lectures on the subject of the too difficult to do box. It's such an intriguing title. All of us here know what he means, but I think he and I may know more what he means than many others in the audience. I congratulate, too, the UEA for organising them. What a marvellous lineup of people you have got, and how fortunate are the students and indeed the wider audience who are coming to appreciate them. But may I also thank the university for making the immaculate arrangements for our visit this evening. Actually, we had thought it would rain cats and dogs all the way. It doesn't rain in Swaffham, where we live, ever, but, you know, it does rain in the rest of the county, and I could imagine appearing really like a drowned rat, and the Immaculate Henry was there, you know, ready. Everything was perfect. Now, as Charles said in his own introduction to the series earlier this year, the worlds of academe and politics have a great deal to offer one another. And I know it will have been Charles's hope, as indeed it is mine, that some of the students of politics who are present this evening, or who are present at some of the other lectures, will themselves wish to enter the political world. If they do, they will certainly find that this series of lectures, describing as it does some of the very practical problems that there are in introducing and making policies work, has been a great help to them. They will also know already, if they are interested in entering politics, that people who want to be or who are politicians have exactly the same qualities and failings as the rest of the human race. So there should be no surprise that from time to time they fail in their endeavours to make the world a better place. Because, and I'm sure Charles will agree with me, you very quickly realise that government is quite difficult. You also realise that within our British political system, you cannot, when planning and executing change, make the same assumptions as you might make if you were running a large business, for example, for at least two reasons. One is that if you are in government, you can only really plan for 5 years at a time, that is, within the bounds of a parliamentary term. And the other is that whereas on the board of a business, you can usually assume that there is a shared agenda, within a cabinet, you cannot. These are just some of the constraints on the exercise of power, which have caused me throughout my life, and certainly not just my political life, to wonder if power is an illusion. I have a great curiosity in the whole question of power, because curiosity was the reason that I went into national politics in the first place. I wanted to see what it was like where the big decisions were taken. I had a professional career in education and then a political career in local government, and I really wanted to see who it was that appeared to be making these lunatic decisions that were affecting all of the rest of us and apparently not knowing how we worked. That was certainly how it felt at the time. But what I found very quickly was what Aneurin Bevan so memorably described, that power is not only elusive, but it is perhaps also illusory. Now, some of you may know the anecdote I'm about to tell. This is how Mr. Bevan described power in an anecdote recounted by Michael Foote in his biography of Bevan. I adore this story because I know it to be true. The story goes as follows. I can't do a Welsh accent, and I would not insult Mr. Bevan's memory by trying. That's Councillor Jackson, a very important man, his father had said to him. What's the council? Bevan had asked. Very important place indeed, and they are important men, his father had replied. When I got older, this is Bevan speaking, I said to myself, the place to get is the council. That's where the power is. So I worked very hard, and in association with my fellows, when I was about 20 years of age, I got on the council. I discovered when I got there that power had been there, but it had just gone. So I made some inquiries, being an earnest student of social affairs, and I learned that power had slipped down to the county council. That was where it was and where it had gone to. So I worked very hard, and I got there, and it had gone from there too. I love this. It's actually from Peter Hennessy's Never Again, but it was Michael Foote who recounted the anecdote. And it is indeed interesting to know how people actually define power, and in particular, political power. Quite recently, Lord McAlpine told me that he had once asked this question of Harold Wilson. He, Lord McAlpine, was in Number 10 with the Prime Minister. Don't ask. I've no reason, I've no idea why. A former treasurer of the Conservative Party, or rather a future treasurer as he was at that time, was in Number 10 with Mr. Wilson, but he was. It was a warm summer's day. Mr. Wilson had the windows open, and a military band on Horse Guards Parade were playing Gilbert and Sullivan. Now, according to Lord McAlpine, Harold Wilson, when he was asked what political power was, said, "You can hear they're playing Iolanthe. I asked them to do that. That is political power." Now, there will be a wide variety of views in this room on what constitutes political power. I would define power in politics as the ability to achieve change conferred upon government through the ballot box via Parliament. And I put it that way because one of my most enduring memories, and one which has shaped my whole attitude to politics, possibly to life, is of the general election in 1945. For the avoidance of all doubt, I will announce that I was born in 1940. You know, you don't have to calculate it. I was 5. It was 1945. And VE Day was on May the 8th, when in our village in northeast Norfolk, and there is a book about it, that's the only reference I shall make, there had been a barn dance for which I had proudly supplied, and it's funny the things you remember, a jam jar of marigolds to decorate the barn. It made a big impact, as you can imagine, as part of the general festivities. The election was held on July the 5th, but the results were announced only on July the 26th that year, and you'll recall that was because they had to delay the results because of counting the votes that had come in from troops and others serving abroad. Now, everybody was out in the village street. Gosh, I can remember this so clearly. And they were calling out either "we've won" or "they've won," according. And I said to my mother, "What's happened?" And she said, "They've got rid of Mr. Churchill." Now, I can distinctly remember thinking that this must mean that, despite the barn dance and the marigolds, the Germans had, after all, won the war. Because what other they could have been powerful enough to get rid of Mr. Churchill? And that it had been the power of the ballot box was something I only later came to understand. In his own introductory lecture, Charles lists policy areas which qualify for the too difficult to do box. And he names, indeed, an impressive list of ghastly dilemmas for politicians: climate change, funding of political parties, Britain and Europe, gender discrimination, public sector pensions, nuclear disarmament. And he added, these are all areas where hopes and expectations were disappointed despite some substantial progress. He added, for the second tranche, welfare reform, House of Lords reform, there's another thing, immigration, regulation of the banks, child poverty, social exclusion, counter-terrorism, and the ageing population. Now, the interesting thing about all of these policy areas is that they are difficult, but of course successive governments, including the last one and the present, continue to try to tackle them. The joint difficulties, of course, of 5-year parliamentary terms and the temptation for politicians to make problems which are obviously universal into a partisan matter do not facilitate solutions. But the area of my interest has always been more fundamental than the issues themselves. And what I want to try to explore with you this evening is this question, the question of whether the constraints on the exercise of power, and they can be many, I mean, they can be the context, for example, if you're in government after your party has already been in power for a long time, or if it has freshly taken the reins, the legacy of the policy you inherit, even the personality of the political leaders, and of course, in Macmillan's words, events, dear boy, whether those constraints can actually overcome the democratic processes that we have in place. In other words, you know, when you get in, you're so swamped that you can't actually exercise the political power. Or, like Bevan, even when you think you've just got it in your grasp, you find that it has gone from there too. Now, many elements, of course, go to make up the successful exercise of political power in our system. My own strongly held view is that the most important of these elements is a sufficient mandate from the electorate, that is, a good parliamentary majority. In the end, the ballot box and Parliament are the only legitimate means that we in our system have of exercising political power, and it's a means, as Churchill once famously remarked, that is a great deal better than the other systems which have been tried from time to time. And after the 1997 election, the Hansard Society Commission did a study of the working of Parliament. And they pointed out, and this is a quote, that Parliament provides the vital link between the electorate and the government. Governments are accountable to the people through general elections. Between elections, Parliament is the principal means by which government can be held to account for its activities, and it is the voice of the electorate. So all of those things are important. The electorate, their views as expressed through the ballot box, and then translated into the power to act by Parliament. Each element is important. It does follow, of course, that governments which have little respect for Parliament also have little respect for the electorate that put them into power, and indeed for the concept of accountability. Now, I'm not going to tease Charles because it'll sound as if I am, but, you know, I'm going on then to tease myself. I mean, I think he may agree that when his party got into power, it was tremendously exciting. It was an absolute landslide. It was a wonderful victory. But it is true that the Labour Party had been in opposition for a long time and had got used to dealing very quickly with special advisers to arrive at conclusions. And they did find Parliament a bit of a bore when they got in. And I certainly think that Tony Blair did. But oh my word, how interesting it is when things get difficult, and how often political leaders then appear in the tea room, in the smoking room, you know, even in the voting lobby, my goodness. And we see it as well now with David Cameron. You know, he will appear in the restaurant, or he will appear, you know, around the place. And they all have to come to it in the end, because of course it's where it is. And it is so funny to watch it happen. People arrive, they think, I've won. Good, I'll get on with it. And then there is this, you know, awkward fact of Parliament. And we did notice this with Blair, and I'm not in the Commons now, but, you know, when I am, you know something's going wrong if you've got Osborne and Mr. Cameron kind of creeping about. So it's really quite interesting. Now, I want to give now two illustrations of the fundamental importance of the electoral mandate. In other words, the ballot box. One of them is the Labour victory of 1945, and the other is the Conservative victory of 1992. Now, I've chosen 1945 because I really do think Clement Attlee, you know, is the best. I mean, he just is such an astonishing political figure. And I'm going to be giving some of my favourite quotes. Well, I'm afraid they may be very familiar to all of you, but I do it because I love just remembering and repeating them and imagining what kind of person he must have been. But if ever there was a mandate for change from the electorate, it was that given to Clement Attlee in 1945. And it is not odd now to think that quite a lot of people at the time, according to press reports and commentaries, were surprised by the result, because it had been predicted from opinion polling throughout the 2 or 3 preceding years. It is also the case that the population had a bit more to do in 1943, 1944 and 1945 than look at opinion polls. I mean, I do agree there. But someone who actually hadn't really looked at the opinion polls was Winston Churchill. And it is the case that he had, when they were drawn to his attention, he took no notice of them, and the result, when it came, was a great shock to him. It was also a shock, of course, to me, aged 5, but I couldn't really be expected to know as much as Churchill at that time. His valet, who had to break the news to him, broke it to him inevitably. He was in his bath. He was either in his bath, as you will know, or he was in bed with a cat on his knees and a glass of champagne. But on this occasion, he was in his bath, and the valet said he turned quite grey. He accepted at once, obviously, that the people had spoken, and that was that. And it is interesting, isn't it? The electorate, you see, were aware of and appreciative of Churchill's role in the war, but they knew that it was time to move on to the challenge of the peace, and they voted accordingly. But even so, and this is the interesting thing, and despite that thumping victory, And despite another thing which is jolly useful for political leaders to have, and that is a sort of consensus about what needs doing. And I know Mrs Thatcher is a Marmite figure. I mean, she's a Marmite figure even in the Conservative Party. But the fact was, when she was elected the first time, it was clear that there were quite a lot of things to do. You know, the balance between trade unions and the democratic process had got a bit out of skew. The economy was very difficult, and there was a consensus that something had to be done about all of that. And of course, in 1945, it was so clear that what had to be done was, you know, housing, the reconstruction of Britain, the rebuilding of the economy. There were other difficult things as well, which I shall come on to. But, and this is fascinating, I think. This is how Douglas Jay, who at the time was an economic advisor to Attlee, he records this in his autobiography. He describes the feeling in Number 10 in the months following the election. I mean, you wouldn't believe it, really. This is what he said. My most vivid impression in all these months at Number 10 was the falsity of the illusion harboured by journalists, academics and others that something called power resides in the hands of a Prime Minister. The picture drawn or imagined is of a great man sitting down in his office, pulling great levers, issuing edicts and shaping events. Nothing could be further from the truth in the real life of Number 10 as I knew it. So far from pulling great levers, the Prime Minister at this time found himself hemmed in by relentless economic or physical forces and faced with problems which had to be solved, but which could not be solved. And it's obvious that the context in this case, the sheer scale of the economic and structural difficulties which had to be faced, had quickly overcome the euphoria of the election. Not that the words Attlee and euphoria are words which sit easily together. Many people here will know the story of Attlee's first meeting as Prime Minister on the evening of the 26th of July 1945 with King George VI, as recounted by Peter Hennessy. I quote, "The meeting began with a long, embarrassed silence, each man being as self-effacing as the other. Eventually, Attlee said, 'I've won the election.' George VI replied, 'I know, I heard it on the 6 o'clock news.' After the meeting, apparently the King remarked to his private secretary, 'I gather they call the PM Clem. Clam would be more like it.' But of course there were obvious and massive constraints on this new government's exercise of political power. When you think about the problems which were facing Attlee and his government, they were awesome. Overwhelming economic problems, the developing Cold War, Indian independence, inescapable overseas commitments, and the sky-high expectations of an electorate just emerging from the exhausting and debilitating experience of the Second World War. And of course, there was obviously no money to do anything with. And yet, to misquote Bevan, power had not gone from there too, because this unassuming man, partly because of his profound respect for the democratic process and his supreme mastery of the cabinet system of government and his overwhelming mandate, achieved, I think arguably, greater and more lasting change than any of his successors to date. I love his management style. I think it is best described as monosyllabic. He believed that it was the Prime Minister in the end who should, I quote, be able in the last resort to decide between policies. I interpret this as meaning that he wasn't much of a consensus man when push came to shove. He did have one serious policy weakness, in that, according to Douglas Jay, quote, he treated economics very much like medicine, a subject on which there were experts and on which it was wise to find a second opinion. He, in fact, did preside over the convertibility crisis of 1947, the devaluation in 1949. They weren't necessarily great moments in our history, but because he was able, and not all political leaders can, to keep sight of the big picture, while at the same time managing the political process. I can't tell you how rare that is in political leaders. I mean, really it is. But he could do both of those things, and because of that, his achievements were enormous. He had great respect for Parliament. I often think he had greater respect for Parliament than he did for his own cabinet. He was certainly keener to announce things to Parliament than he was to the cabinet. He thought some of them were not quite sound. Funny that. And he made a point, for example, of keeping Parliament informed at the earliest possible opportunity, always, even on very sensitive defence issues. He excelled at the dry put-down. He once told Churchill that a monologue is not a decision. And somebody needed to tell him that. Anyway, he told him that. And there's another wonderful story. I don't know whether Charles knows this. It's a story about Richard Crossman. When he was a new backbencher, he came into the House and he had had a 4-week trip to the Middle East. And he bored the daylights out of absolutely everybody, saying, I must tell you about the Middle East. When I was in the Middle East, he put down questions, he called adjournment debates, he insisted on addressing committees and everything he possibly could in Parliament, and he was the biggest bore possible. And he kept agitating to be let in to see the Prime Minister. And in the end, the whips, thinking that perhaps Attlee would be able to deal with him and end all of this bore, they arranged it. So he went in, and Attlee said, good to see you, and Crossman launched into this great thing and spoke for 15 minutes without taking any sort of breath at all. And then there was a long pause, and Attlee sucked on his pipe, and he said, how's your mother? It makes me die every time. I just think it's the funniest thing. And the fact is, it got out, and it got out through one of Attlee's own private secretaries. That's how, I mean, I need hardly say that Crossman would not have gone back into the lobby and told everybody in Parliament. Obviously not. His handling of the press was legendary. And I've got to quote this. It's self-indulgence on my part, but he was asked in a television interview just before the 1951 election, I mean one of them, I believe there were two, and this was the interviewer saying, will you tell us something of how you view the election prospects? He replied, oh, we shall go in with a good fight, very good chance of winning if we go in competently. Oh, what an Attlee word. On what will Labour take its stand? Oh, that's something we shall be announcing shortly. What are your immediate plans, Mr. Attlee? My immediate plans are to go down to decide just that thing as soon as I can get away from here. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the coming election? No. Some other people love this quote as well. But of course, self-deprecating he may have been. But I expect many of you know that when he retired, he wrote a short rhyme for his brother Tom. And it does reveal an ironic awareness of what he achieved. Few thought he was even a starter. There were many who thought themselves smarter. But he ended PM, CH and OM, an Earl and a Knight of the Garter. Now, my second example is John Major. When he took power, if you recall, at about this time of year, just earlier than this, in 1990. And of course, the election was not until 1992. And when he succeeded Margaret Thatcher in 1990, he was very conscious of the fact that he had inherited and not won his own majority. The problems which faced him included the hated poll tax, a looming crisis on Europe, oh dear, within the Conservative Party, it's all very new, all this, and increasing tensions in the Near and Middle East. Now, these were problems, but I must say they really pale into insignificance when you compare them with the problems that were facing Attlee. In his autobiography, Major says, the first 18 months, that is before his election in 1992, were the time of greatest promise for me. There was much I hoped to do after the election, but which, as things turned out, I would not achieve. I shall regret this all my days. On becoming Prime Minister, in 1990, he had at once set up a Cabinet Committee in the November immediately to monitor the increasingly dangerous situation in the Gulf, which led to the start of hostilities in January 1991. This was the committee that was the target of the famous mortar bomb attack. I wonder if you remember that. The IRA parked a van in Whitehall outside the old War Office, very appropriately, and launched a mortar bomb, and by the sheerest chance, because I can't think how you could have aimed, it somehow got into a window in Downing Street where there was a committee going on, and it was really very, nobody was hurt. I think everybody went under the table, and then they went downstairs to finish the meeting. But what was so funny was the different ways in which people described their demeanour, or the demeanour of others, when the bomb struck. And David Mellor, of course, who everybody said was the first under the table, had, I'm sure nobody will report this, was the very one who talked endlessly of his sheer heroism in the light of, you know, everything. And we were all going into the Queen Elizabeth Centre afterwards. I wasn't in the cabinet, but a reporter came up and said, "Oh, Mr. Mellor, can you tell us your impressions of the mortar bomb in Downing Street?" And Francis Maud was with us and said, "That is the most unnecessary question I've ever heard." Very fine. Anyway, it was a great joke for ages. But the Gulf War, and it was not the only armed conflict, of course, over which he had to preside, because there was the Bosnian situation as well. That war had an undeniable impact on John Major's career as Prime Minister. He wasn't blown off course, but he felt that it had limited what else he'd been able to achieve. And he rightly notes in his autobiography a fresh approach, a new education agenda, a series of public service changes, the replacement of the poll tax. All of this was a sufficient agenda. But within weeks of my election as PM, we faced an unavoidable obligation that dwarfed all domestic concerns. We went to war in the Gulf. But of course, the real problem for John Major was his parliamentary majority. When he did get it in 1992, it was a majority of 21. Now, we knew straight away at Conservative Central Office on election night that it wouldn't be enough. It was just as if the ballot box had said, actually, we don't like you much, but that's what you've got, get on with it. And sadly, no fewer than 8 Conservative MPs died during the course of that Parliament. We lost all 8 by-elections. The Maastricht rebels accounted for a deficiency of another 8, sometimes more. This was a coming and going problem. And at one stage, we worked out we were governing with a majority of -3. All sorts of things had to be done. Ministers weren't allowed outside the M25 at night, and difficult coves were sent off on wonderful trips to the Caribbean. You know, this kind of thing. You really need to go. We have to have your views. You know, you'll be there for a month, so make the most of it. A lot of these things went on. I mean, it even got to the stage of, did you want to bypass or not? Really did get to that. I do promise you it was appalling. But it wasn't easy. But what rather does interest me is that historians of the period, or even the many PhD students now examining it, very rarely point out that we only lost 3 votes during the whole Parliament. Now, one of those was Maastricht, so it was sort of major-ish, you could say. Another one was on VAT on heating oil, on which the Labour Party mounted, you know, a really short, sharp attack, and down we went, and so that was that. And I really can't remember, I'm really sorry, there may be somebody who does remember, I don't remember what the other one was, but anyway, there were only 3. And we really, it did involve very careful planning, apart from the jokey way I've just described it. It involved negotiations with colleagues, An enormous amount of work had to go on just getting the business through. And one thing you can say about that government, and I think this is hugely, hugely healthy, that government did not take for granted either the electorate or Parliament. No way. But even so, you can't manage with a parliamentary majority of that side. John Major was determined from the start to run his cabinet on a consensual basis. He famously declared that Margaret Thatcher had liked to announce the decisions that the cabinet had taken before they took them at the start of cabinet meetings, just to make everything neat. And Ian Gilmore put it another way, saying her belief that dialogue was a waste of time rather than a means of arriving at an agreed course of action was part of her rejection of consensus politics. Actually, Major himself was very ambivalent about power. He wrote in his autobiography, "I think I felt differently about power than seek any other Prime Minister this century. In one sense, having power reminded me that it needed to be exercised in a way that did not make you different from other people." Well, I know that this is mission impossible. I mean, there may be other views here, and I would like to hear those, but you know, if you are vested with this enormous responsibility, and the ballot box has put you there, I think it does make you different, but only for the period, I quickly add. But, you know, anyway, there's no doubt at all that if he'd won a bigger majority in 1992, he would have had more confidence in taking on the rebels within the party. He would have been able to take a firmer line on many issues, and he was consistently and very unfairly criticised by the press and others for dithering. I don't think he did dither, but of course at every stage he and all of us had to calculate what we could actually get through the parliamentary process. It was definitely the ballot box what won that election, no matter what the Sun said. Of course, the Sun was saying something quite other by the end, in any case. Now, the key point about these examples is that they illustrate, I hope, that within our system it is the ballot box which wins. And I would suggest that at the last election, the ballot box did it again, with exquisite precision. It gave no one party a majority. It obliged the main party leaders to think outside the box and put the national interest first. Now, I spent a long time on doorsteps during the election. I know Charles will have done, and other people here will have done the same. The main message I got was, we don't want any of you. We are sick of adversarial politics. You're all in it for yourselves. Now, we want something different. Go and find it. Matthew Paris, writing in the Times in that year on the 13th of May, said, "Think again," said the moment. And Janice Turner, also writing in the Times, said, "Although accused of delivering some unholy mess, the electorate seems to me to have got exactly what it wanted. A political class flummoxed and humbled, who can never again take their votes in vain. Whatever complexion of government emerges, it will need to factor in the public will." Whether or not you feel that the coalition is factoring in the public will as a series of uncontrollable events unfold, that was certainly the public mood at the time. I felt the election result reflected what I'd been hearing as I tramped the streets. And this is now my final point, and I hope to hear your views on this. I do now begin to wonder if my optimistic view of the power of the ballot box is dimming a little in the light of the global problems that we are currently facing. While democracies in the past have successfully faced down international wars, international terrorism and the like, we're now confronted by huge, life-changing developments in the world which are answerable to no one, not even the ballot box. Now, you take change. Charles devoted a very thoughtful section of his introductory lecture to the problems posed by accelerating change. He wrote, "Many changes are highly beneficial, but others bring faraway decisions into the heart of local communities, sometimes with deeply negative consequences. I would take this further, and I would ask you if you think some change is making the democratic process irrelevant or perhaps incapable. I give two examples which are interlinked. You might like to consider, as governments are currently having to do, that technological change, in so many respects admirable and life-enhancing, is now so rapid that it is outpacing the ability of governments to regulate it. One banal example is the video game. The last government, as one of its final acts, passed widely welcomed legislation to regulate the labelling of video games according to content and age suitability. The coalition adopted the legislation, but because it involved European and other procedures, it still hasn't completed its legislative passage. Meanwhile, video games can now be viewed on mobile phones, to which the regulations, so carefully in course of preparation, don't apply. I mean, pathetic, but it is so. You could say, I say, the whole system should smarten up its act. You would be right. But there are many and much more serious examples to do with, say, the speed of operation of the financial markets, the rapidity of their computerized reactions to global financial movements, no human being involved, and the effect of all of this on elected governments. This is being played out, of course, in the world, and more particularly in Europe right now. I expect many people here will have read The Fear Index by Robert Harris. Well, I don't know what you do about it all. Fortunately, I don't have to. But I recently heard Norman Lamont on the radio talking about the democracy of the markets. That's not how I see it, and not how they are portrayed in the Fear Index. And is it because some people sense that the immensity of some of these problems cannot be solved by their own governments? That, for example, Greece and Italy have put in place so-called technocratic governments because the democratic systems in those countries seem incapable of coping with economic and financial breakdown within the Eurozone. Where is that going to take them and us? Judging by the protests in Athens and Rome, nowhere much and nowhere particularly democratic. And how strange it is that at the same time, parts of the Arab world are struggling with the birth pangs of democracy, while the southern edges of the Eurozone, not so far away, seem to be experiencing the demise of the political class. Obviously, the single currency was always incompatible with nation-state sovereignty, and, we're embarrassed to admit it now, and it's cost us dear. But before we in the UK are tempted to feel the merest tinge of democratic superiority, and we are very good at that as a nation, do I detect a bit of a move towards the same reliance on the technocrat and the expert in the sheer number of bodies we have now set up, both governments or all governments, entitled independent? The Office for Budget Responsibility, for example, the Independent Office for National Statistics, the czars, the commissioners, all these people we have, did anybody vote for them? Are they accountable? Whatever else, they are signs of an erosion in the trust of government and a growing feeling that elected administrations have limitations. Maybe their existence is an indication of the sophistication of our democracy, or maybe, emphatically, it is not. And the latter, I think, would be the view of the St. Paul's protesters and their counterparts throughout the world. They mustn't be ignored. They have a really important message. Democracies need to look at the way they're operating and what people are saying. But even those protesters, again according to the Times, it is the only paper I read, I don't like it much, but I like the others less. Even the St. Paul's protesters are finding democracy a bit tricky. There's apparently been a dispute in their camp about money. What else? And a spokesman, a Ms. Jones, is quoted as saying, this was December the 2nd, it's becoming intimidating. If you don't agree with what the leaders say, they shout at you and can be quite aggressive. This is the St. Paul's protesters. We are now being ruled by an elite inner circle. They are telling us what to think. They go off and have these secret meetings at Starbucks. A small number have decided they are more equal and are controlling the rest of us. I love it. They're finding practical democracy difficult. It is. But even so, I am optimistic. Greece and Italy may have difficulties with their democratic processes right now, but it's not going to be forever. And what about Ireland? Ireland is coping with equally enormous financial problems, a tiny population, but it's doing so via the ballot box, with an elected government mandated to find the solutions which are eye-wateringly hard. Even in this country, you may not agree, but even in this country, I do think many people are relieved that we have a coalition government because they think that the state of things needs more than a solution from just one political party. Many of the newer members of the EU have joined precisely because they see it as a passport to democracy. And the Arab Spring is a struggle with the same goal. It's salutary to recall Douglas Jay's image of the great man in Number 10, striving to find solutions to problems which cannot be solved. But remember, in Attlee's case, many of them were solved, thanks to him and the will of the people expressed through the ballot box. In the end, as Margaret Thatcher didn't say, you can't buck the ballot box.
Fantastic, really well done. Tremendous, I enjoyed it a lot. Now, we're going to have questions for a while. Is that okay? Do you want to sit? Are you okay still standing? Or do you want to sit down for a while? Gillian, that was absolutely fantastic, really wonderful. I agree both with the anecdotes and with many of the deep fundamental points. My own style anecdote about being asked to do unpalatable things at times of difficulty was when the last Labour Prime Minister asked me if I'd like to be a special envoy to sorting out the port in Basra in Iraq. He did.
You got the build for it.
Yeah, well, I think he thought it would keep me away from Parliament. And it also had the possible advantage that I might not come back. It's one of his many kind offers which I felt bound to refuse. Gillian, you raised so many profound questions. I'm just going to pick three to talk about. First, what you described was the difficulty of the relationship between political theory and political practice. The anecdotes you told, the story you told, are actually a constant frustration to me here, because political theorists often find it hard to get hold of the actual circumstances that are there. And the core of it, as you said, is the ballot box. So I think this first question about the relationship of practical politics to what ought to be done. Many people get very irritated with politicians for worrying about winning elections, but it is actually the core of it. And I think that's a very interesting area to follow. The second, you talked about the personalities, and I think insufficient attention is given to personalities in politics, and particularly the role of leadership in politics. I think that leaders change as they're in politics, what they experience. Certainly prime ministers do. I was talking yesterday to Bernard Donahue, who was Harold Wilson's advisor, and he talked about how Harold had changed a great deal with the pressures of office. But we were talking also of what will be going on in David Cameron's mind at the moment, with this experience of the Eurozone and what's happening, the things he said in the past. Whatever sympathy or lack of sympathy you have for him, he will be going through an immensely difficult self-educational process that he has to deal with. And I think that question of leadership you highlighted in a very important way. And then this third question of how democracy evolves in a global world, with change being so very fast. I think this is a deeply profound point that you have raised. And I don't think there's a lot of good theory about it either. There's various people talking about it, but what do you actually do when the limits of the power of a national government are so great, the limits are so great, and change is happening so fast? So those are just three I've picked, but others will have their own points. But I'm now going to open it to the floor, and I'm going to take questions in threes, if I can, for Gillian to come back. Firstly, lady right down here. Nick and Henry have got the mics, and we're whizzing around, bringing them to you to raise. Could you just identify yourself?
Yes, my name is Diana Stevenson. I live in Norwich North, and I'm going to be competing against Chloe in the next election. So I'm not a natural voter, but thank you. Your immensely sort of rational and good-humoured lecture has made me realise that if we had more women in Parliament, we could maybe all get along, regardless of our political backgrounds. But I'd like to ask, having lived in Australia for 4 years, where not only is voting compulsory, but you get fined if you don't do it, one of the things about their system is, could we not make voting compulsory, but also have the box that says none of the above?
It might win, though. Then what would you do?
Because then we have to think of a different way of doing things. I think we've got stuck in a historic system. And part of it is straight lines and hierarchies. As a Quaker, I love the Australian New Parliament building, which is much more of a semicircle. I'll stop there, because obviously, I'm into speeches, but
thank you, Diane. There's a good point. Next question or comment. Yes, right at the back. Sorry,
and right here.
Can you take Peter first, Nick, and then right at the back?
I mean, if you take an issue like climate change, I mean, really, the effect it has on individuals, okay, in actually sort of going to do the things that are necessary, really makes them almost want to avoid sort of voting on the issue altogether. So in one way, really, are we ever going to deal with an issue such as that without actually having some sort of compromise between all parties to decide that this is not something that's got to be dealt with through the ballot box as such, but it's got to be put to one side and everybody's got to say, look, for the sake of the planet, we must do something about it. The other thing I wanted to sort of raise on global issues is that, we get a lot of people talking about Europe being sort of a nonsense and all the rest of it. But I remember when John Gummer was the Minister for Environment saying quite clearly that he felt that had we not been in Europe, we would not be able to deal with some of the major issues that face the world today. And my view is that we can't avoid doing things collectively worldwide, and therefore, it's not just what happens here, it's what happens elsewhere and what partnerships we come to.
Thank you very much, Peter. Gentleman right at the back there.
Duncan McInnes, you raised the issue of every 5 years there is the ballot box, and then once a government is elected, then it is the responsibility of Parliament to hold the executive to account. But I really wonder now that the issue of party management is so strong, that how effective is Parliament in actually doing that? And really, in a sense, do we not go to the ballot box, have the election, and then basically things happen for 5 years and there is no real accountability on our behalf?
Thank you very much. Gillian, do you want to take those three?
Yes, I will. Mrs. Stevenson, I would really like to expatiate on the thing of women. There is no doubt that if you do have a team of women, things are done differently, and it isn't that there are no disagreements. It is not that at all. But over a long career, both professional and political, I have merely noted that women always ask, how will it work? That is what I mean, I don't know how long we've got, Charles. I really have to tell this story.
No, we've got to 1:15, and it's about
fine.
5 to. Now, we can close earlier if we want
No,
to,
no.
but we've got about 20 minutes.
It's going to take me ages to tell this story.
I'll be timing you.
When I was in the Department for Education, known just as well by Charles as me, we introduced a new policy on nursery vouchers. I will leave aside the policy. But there was an issue involving a helpline. And I was getting a lot of complaints from people who were, ringing up saying, we can't really find out about this. And I said, oh, right, what about the helpline? And there didn't seem to be much of an answer. And I rang the helpline, and nobody answered. And I don't think there'd be many men that would have rung the helpline, because they would have thought it might feel silly, or sort of, oh, it's only me. Anyway, I do think women do things very practically. I'm loath to introduce compulsory voting here. I would much rather that we made people really want to vote, and it is interesting. When people feel the country is in a state or they're really sick of a government, there are higher turnouts than, you know, at other times when they coast along. But a lot of that is education, I'm sure Charles will agree, and the more you can have political activity, not party necessarily, within schools, certainly within colleges and universities, the more enthusiastic people get. I also think that you need inspirational people who are elected, young people, very diverse groups of people, every kind of person, who will seize the imagination of the electorate. So, you know, there are a huge number of issues here. You talk about different ways of doing things. This is why I say we should be listening to what the Occupy groups are saying. You know, what are they telling us? Are we missing this? We shouldn't be. It's a very big movement now. There are lots of other movements as well, but this is rather unified as such movements go. We should be listening. Are they telling something that us about the way we should be doing things? So that's not a very good answer to your very thoughtful question, but I've tried to, you know. The other thing I would say about importing different voting systems is I honestly do think it's difficult to import almost any policy from another country because you don't necessarily have the context that suits it. I mean, why did they have to make it compulsory?
Well, they'd be too busy at their barbecues, wouldn't they?
That, you see, that's it. And we don't have the weather, really, so, you know. Now, Mr. Medhurst, you two are talking about, you know, global issues, and climate change is indeed something that preoccupies all of us, and all of us feel very powerful. What is interesting and really, you know, a bit regrettable now is that the sort of neo attitudes are coming in, with people like Nigel Lawson saying, I don't believe in climate change. Well, we could have stood him outside just now when you came in and said, you really still don't already? I mean, there's probably a disagreement around how much of is it man-made and how much is it cyclical. What you can't argue with is that it is happening. That is the thing. And you know what you do about it. And actually, to be fair, I think within this country there is a pretty fair consensus on that issue amongst the parties. You know, details, I mean, you know, do you have turbines and what do you have? These are details, but there is an understanding in the political class or group that it's got to be tackled together as a cross-party issue. Doesn't sound like it, but in practice I think it is, if that is any sort of a comfort. Now, did you talk about Europe as well? Right. What I think about Europe is that it was a great ideal. I voted in, whenever we voted, was it 1970, early 1970s, you know, I voted yes. And there is no doubt that on things like employment law and a whole range of other issues, Europe has done a marvellously good job. It's also been, funnily enough, a kind of beacon to get some of the Eastern European new democracies to smarten up their acts in order to get membership. And, you know, all of these things are extremely positive. Where there has never been a realisation of what democracy really is across Europe is in the different democratic systems that all the countries have. And if you asked a Frenchman what he meant by the word democracy, you would not get the same answer as if I asked you. And this is the same across the whole of the EU. This is a really important point. So that while they're all saying we're democratic, in their heads they're meaning something different. Now, an example of this is in French and English the word for mayor. If you say mayor, we think one thing, mostly, which is to do with ermine and chains and, you know, jolly and Dick Whittington and that kind of thing. Good, but benign. In France, if you say mayor, it means a person locally and directly elected with enormous powers, national powers, invested in him to get things done. And it's very different. But you think you're saying the same thing. Now, it's the same with democracy. You really have got me on my subject. You know, I shall bore for Britain now. But But that is why Europe is so difficult. You've got 27 nations with different formations about what they mean about democracy. You know, it is really difficult to get agreement on delicate, nuanced areas. And the euro is showing us that there is truly a lack of accountability in the system, because when the euro has had its difficulties, there's no system to stop people borrowing, which there ought to have been set up at the beginning. And I often wonder if it was a question of difficulty in translation. As Charles said, I am a linguist, was once. And, you know, I used in those terrible European meetings, oh, I feel so sorry for David Cameron, not just because of the situation, but having to be there and listen to it all for 24 hours. You know. But I used to listen to them making mistakes. And I used to think, you know, I hope this doesn't cause an international and diplomatic incident. It never did. And what never translated was jokes, as it happens, which is about which one could also talk for 3 hours. But it's a fabulous dream. It's an ideal. It's good that it's got where it's got. I don't want it to end or break up. I really don't. But I do think that the lack of accountability in the European system has caused huge financial economic problems for the whole world. So, so much to your surprise, we might be on the same side on this, possibly. I see you're nodding anyway. Now, the gentleman at the back talked about 5-year parliaments. I mean, a sort of elected dictatorship in a way, you know, once you've got them, you've got them. Charles, you'll have to help me with this. I mean, there's nothing perfect. This is the trouble. If you elect a government, it really has got to have sufficient mandate to do what it promised. I do think that. And if it's constantly worrying about losing votes, it isn't going to deliver what it said it would, which I think is bad. Certainly with our new intake in the Conservative Party, we have a lot of people who are willing to rebel at any moment. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Well, a lot of them are people who've done a very great deal before they became MPs. I just think it isn't perfect. But either you've got a mandate and you can govern and lead and do what you promised, or you've got a system where the government can be overturned many times. Now, you will remember the Fourth French Republic, because you also may have been 5 in 1945. I hope you don't mind me saying this. No, you were probably not born, but anyway, you must remember the Fourth French Republic. When there was a new Prime Minister every 3 weeks, can you remember Monsieur Pinet, Monsieur Mollet, Monsieur Monet, and so on and so on? Now, you really don't want that sort of system. You've got to have a run at it if you can do it. Remember when we had the Heath 2 elections, the Wilson after the war, actually, it doesn't do the country any good. We're not used to it. I think there are disadvantages and some advantages. Charles, what do you think?
I just add 2 points to what you said. Firstly, the academic research that's been done on political rebellions, mainly by Philip Cowley and his team at Nottingham University, demonstrates that over the last years, the quantity of rebellions by backbenchers in Parliament has just gone up consistently. So at the moment, the Conservative Party has more rebellions by its backbench MPs than ever in history. The Labour government, with its big majorities, also had enormous rebellions. And in contrast, the parliaments of the 50s, 60s and 70s had far lower number of rebellions. And so the idea that the MPs are in general not rebellious, I think is not the case. It's reinforced by the existence of a far more active House of Lords than used to be the case. And so the House of Lords is getting involved and taking decisions in various ways, which then come back to the Commons, which provokes those further rebellions. So, in fact, I think the evidence would show the rebellions have been greater than people think, and the power of the party whips has been less than people think in recent years. The second thing, which I think is a very big point, which Gillian made in her lecture, and which I think is insufficiently understood, is it's very important to understand the arithmetic of Parliament. People don't really. I took some of the most controversial measures through Parliament of the Labour government. ID cards, counter-terrorism, student tuition fees. They were very controversial and very difficult. And the simple arithmetic was, we had the government benches. If everybody else united against us, we then had about 20 to 25 Labour MPs, the so-called campaign group, who would absolutely be against us come what may. And depending what the actual majority was, that meant we maybe had an overall majority of about 40, despite a numeric majority of much more. And those 40 then used that position to negotiate the legislation, and they won on some arguments, lost on others, and they took on a position of great power. They were fundamentally loyal to the government and loyal to the party which had put them in Parliament. They weren't like the campaign group, totally disloyal, or like the bastards in your government who, I'm using the Prime Minister's phrase, not anything else. But they were basically loyal, but they wanted to use their power to be able to bring about change in what was actually passed through Parliament, and they did do that. And it's really quite necessary. Gillian told the story extremely well of John Major's government. Bernard Donoughue, the different example about the Labour government of 74 to 79. The actual arithmetic of Parliament is insufficiently understood, and you described it very well with John Major's government, how that was there. So I think your point is interesting, but I think actually it's not quite working quite that way.
There is another point I would like to make. I mentioned the new intake of Conservative MPs in Parliament at the moment. And I actually do think that after the expenses scandal and the sleaze thing, many of the new people campaigned on, I will do what I promise, which means that they are then involved in rebelling quite a lot of the time on local issues and so on. It's actually, even in my time, the importance of the constituency, I think, has increased. And I do think this is a tremendously good thing. I don't know if there are any people here who are researching that, or quite how you would research it, or what questions you would ask, but that is my feeling. They take it, people always did take constituencies very seriously. It was my first pleasurable shock when I got to Parliament. I found that people were discussing their constituencies all the time. All the time. Have you had this problem? What did you do about this? All the time, in the tea room and everywhere. But it's different now. People feel committed to those who elected them. Many of the people I know, and this leads them to rebel. And that was why they rebelled recently on the Europe thing. The whips couldn't do anything with them. That was it.
Absolutely right.
Which is a good thing.
Absolutely right too.
I would say.
I agree. Now, we've got about 5 minutes left. I'll take a couple more questions if anybody's got a question they'd like to raise. Gentleman there. And I'll take one more if it catches my eye. Gentleman down here. Okay, yeah.
Well, thank you. My English is not quite good, but I do my best. So I'm a French-speaking person. Well, I come from Africa, and I do believe in the power of ballot box. But one day, that power was taken away from me, just because one country in the West decided to recognize someone who has made a coup d'etat. And then other countries went beyond that country. What do you make for that?
Well, I honestly couldn't quite make out the countries that you were referring to. I'm terribly sorry. It's the Congo. The Congo.
Congo.
Oh.
Just wait, we've got a second question.
Okay.
Gentleman there.
Difficult.
Richard Stevenson, I'm on home ground here at UEA because I work here. Your discussion of the question from the back about the nature of parliamentary systems made me think that in a lecture which was tempting us to think that the ballot box was the reason why power was illusionary, you gave a good justification for political power in that elected governments should have a mandate and had the opportunity to take them through. I wondered if you could reflect a bit in the new experiment on coalition governments, whether coalition governments, organised the way we have done this time, create a mandated policy, or is it really that politicians are saying, if you let me have my unpopular policy, then I'll let you have yours?
Okay, Gillian, there's those two, and if you could also wind up when you've done that, I think we've come to the end, but if you can just deal with those two questions and then any concluding remarks you'd like to make.
Well, it's very difficult for me to address it's such a particular question about a country that I do not know at all. I believe that what you said was, political interference by other countries, which obviously makes any attempt at setting up a democracy so much more difficult and perhaps impossible. All I can say is, in many, many African countries, there is the strongest possible attempt still to fight for a democratic system against all the odds. And if you look at what is happening in the Middle East at the moment, those people, of course, are also fighting against the odds, but they haven't given up. And I think also anywhere in Africa, one can look at the example of South Africa, which is really a model and a beacon for almost anywhere in the world, and anywhere where you are in the world would say that. So I don't think that I've answered your question, because I really couldn't hear it very well, and I wonder if, having been born in 1940, I'm going a bit deaf. Don't blame yourself. But all I can say is I think there is a lot of hope in Africa, and it takes a time. But nobody should give up. Look at South Africa. Look at Nelson Mandela, who could have given up and never did. I don't know whether that's helpful. I might perhaps see you afterwards. Now, this question about the coalition, it is so fascinating, I think, the coalition. In the first place, I really believe that the coalition could have gone either way. I mean, it could have been Liberals working with the Labour Party. In the end, the deal was done between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And they all place a great deal of importance on the existence of the coalition agreement. It's rather like a kind of manifesto, you know, and if it isn't in the coalition agreement, it won't do. I actually heard David Cameron, like the day before yesterday, say they get on very well in the cabinet together personally. But it is hugely difficult for what the French would call the adhérents of, you know, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats not to feel they've been betrayed on all kinds of things, which is why the coalition agreement was so important in the first place. I have loved it in the Lords. I have so much enjoyed working with the Liberal Democrats, with a whole group of people whose formation has been completely different from mine, who have quite different expectations, a completely different set of skills, and I have felt refreshed by it. It's not as easy in the Commons, because it is more tribal in the Commons. But I doubt there would be many, except the most rabid in both parties, who, if they were really truthful, wouldn't say, actually, it's worked better than we thought, and we've all learned a lot. I hope that's what they would say. It's what I feel. I know it's what the country wanted. And the country will have a chance to end it at the next election if that is what its judgment is. I think it's been great. But, you know, I suppose that shows what kind of a Tory I am. You'd like me to wind up?
Yes.
Well, I have enjoyed the questions. They're always really, you know, the best part of an evening like this. I wish it could go on a bit longer. I am genuinely worried about the questions I raised at the end. These extraordinary, uncontrollable movements which are not accountable to anybody. How are we going to cope with these? And I puzzled and worried and wondered whether I should put something into the lecture. But I think this. I think for every succeeding generation of politicians or of governments, there are new young people who have grown up with different expectations and different experiences. For someone of my age, there is not a threat really, but a problem with the pace of technological change. For people of 40, it is quite a different thing, and something they may well have been thinking about since they were 12. So I place a huge amount of faith and hope in new generations wishing to undertake this very important thing, which is to get involved in the democratic government of our country and be prepared to make the sacrifices, and actually there are quite a few, in order to do so. And there are successive generations coming on wanting to do this, equipped with their youth and their formation. And I think quite good education, don't you, Charles, one way and another? And so I'm optimistic for that reason. And I want to end the evening on an optimistic note, because I think it is justified. And I believe we will have the people who can cope with these problems, provided we have the wit to vote for them.
Gillian, that was really fantastic. I share your optimism, but I think the way in which you've illuminated our discussion and thinking has been absolutely masterful, or mistressful, if that's the correct phrase. It really has been tremendous. Thank you very, very much indeed for doing it.